Welcome to This Medical Life podcast. These are the stories of medicine with Steve Davis and Dr. Travis Brown.
This is the story of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, Part 2.
Amanda Green is campaigning to raise awareness of CTE after her husband, National Rugby League legend Paul Green, was found unresponsive in his home last year. Paul had a decorated playing career of 162 first-grade games, 7 appearances for Queensland, and represented Australia twice. After his playing career, Paul moved into coaching and won a premiership with North Queensland in 2015. After his death, Paul's brain was donated to the Australian Sporting Brain Bank for examination, where he was diagnosed with a severe form of CTE. Paul was 49 years old. This diagnosis helped Paul's family understand just what had happened and brought some closure. Amanda hopes to shine a light on her late husband's diagnosis so we can advance our approach to detection, education, treatment and support for people and families suffering from CTE. And Amanda's our guest today on This Medical Life. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Amanda, goodness, Paul had an amazing career and rugby, such a physical sport anyway. Is it something you could actually watch him play comfortably?
You know, to be honest, we were young and carefree, and like all young people, you think you're invincible. You're completely living in the moment. So not once did I think that at the time he may be jeopardising his life by playing the sport he loved. But if I knew back then what I now know, yeah, I couldn't have watched him play. I actually struggle to watch the game now and know what those young athletes are doing to their future health, their future brain health. It's really tough to watch.
When was the first time you encountered or heard about CTE?
I know this sounds crazy, but I'd never really heard of CTE before Professor Buckland contacted me. Yes, I had heard of the movie Concussion, but I just thought it was some disease that affected American football players. It's actually not okay that I had been involved in the highest level of professional sport in this country, and for such a long period of time, and I didn't understand that disease, like this disease. That's not okay. We need that to change. We need awareness. We need education.
So if you look back at Paul's behaviour and his mood, when did you notice things start to change for him?
Yeah, it's actually hard to say exactly. However, in 2018, the Cowboys season started with really high expectations. However, unfortunately, that season just did not get off to the start we're all expecting it to. So the pressure really started to build. And it was around this time that I remember thinking Paul just wasn't handling the pressure like he had in the past. He had eaten up stress. He thrived on a stressful environment. He just took it in his stride. But I really noticed he just wasn't handling it like he had. This also coincided with the diagnosis of his best friend, who actually happened to play rugby league as well, of MND. And emotionally, he just didn't handle it at all. He was absolutely distraught and an emotional mess. And I remember being really worried about his well-being at that particular time. So that was kind of the start in my mind.
Mm-hmm. And looking at the diagnosis, how was he assessed for CTE?
The days and weeks around Paul's death are still quite hazy. But from what I understand, Professor Michael Buckland contacted the coroner, and then the coroner put us in touch. So for me, I will be forever grateful to Professor Michael Buckland and the Australian Sports Brain Bank, because if he hadn't made that phone call, if he hadn't reached out, we wouldn't have the answers today. And honestly, I don't know where we'd be. I honestly do not.
Was it a shock to receive this diagnosis?
Honestly, it actually wasn't. What happened that day was so left field, so out of the blue. It just wasn't Paul. I'd look at my kids and the days after we lost Paul, and it'd just break my heart. He loved those kids. He loved all of us. And he told us regularly. So by the time I'd received Paul's diagnosis, I had started to do a bit of research around CTE myself, and it was all lining up. It was all making sense. So when I actually received his diagnosis, I wasn't actually surprised.
How did the diagnosis help you in processing all of this?
It was everything. We could now look back and we could understand and we could rationalise what had happened. Paul was living with a terminal brain disease. We just didn't know it at the time.
Now, you and Paul have a daughter and son, I believe 14 and 11, is that right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes, we do, yes.
How did this diagnosis help with their management or coping with all of this happening?
For them, their dad was healthy. There were no signs that he wasn't well. Yeah, he may have been a little cranky and rather impatient when they didn't do what they were told, but that's dad's, right? So to have this diagnosis, for them to understand their dad was suffering from a terminal brain disease, it was absolutely imperative for their healing, for them to be able to understand that he was sick and for them to be able to, move on with their lives, I suppose.
Being at the age of 14, 11, they're in kind of prime contact sport area, and I'm guessing they may have got Paul's passion for maybe even contact sport or rugby. How do you balance this, knowing that you've had this experience, but the love of the sport and the risks that you're trying to balance? How do you go with that?
This is such a tough one for me. Like you said, my kids love sport. They've been brought up with sport. They're athletic kids. And I see firsthand the benefits they get from playing team sport. The mateship, the camaraderie, the ability to be humble when you lose, the ability to be humble when you win. There's so much more that goes into playing a team sport. So it's not as easy as just pulling them out of their chosen sport. And yes, of course, they love, particularly my son, he loves contact sport. So for me, it's all about, working together. The medical professionals, the sporting organisations, the schools, the parents. It's up to us to work together to ensure that the environment that these kids are playing in is as safe as possible. We owe it to them.
Knowing this diagnosis is out there, how has it made you approach your son's contact sport? Has it changed it in any way? For
me, I suppose it's made me more aware of, what I can do. So, talking to the grassroots coaches, talking to the other parents. So once again, we're all working together to make that training environment, making that playing environment, because, there are things we can do. Making sure that, if someone is injured, they follow the correct protocols in relation to their recovery. Just doing what I can with the grassroots at this stage and, hoping that the powers to be, change it from the top down.
Have you seen any changes in sporting organisations or community groups about brain health?
Yeah, I have. And I do need to commend the NRL for the changes they have made so far in relation to their concussion protocols. However, there is so much more awareness and education needed around CTE. I was actually listening to a current NRL coach on a podcast only recently, I think it was last week, and he clearly didn't understand CTE and its causes. And listening to him speak and his lack of knowledge around this disease, it really upset me, to be honest, and it made me realise just how much education is still needed out there. Now that we know what we know about CTE and its causes, we have a duty of care to people who play contact sport at all levels. We must remember this is a preventable disease.
Absolutely. And look, I can only imagine that you're an asset to your kids' clubs, being able to talk and share experiences with the grassroots coaches, etc. But if we just broaden that out as a final question to ponder, what sort of final advice do you have for anyone, be it parents, kids, coaches, GP, anyone at all? What advice would you leave to us in terms of CTE and your experience with it?
for me, it's about ensuring another person doesn't suffer in silence. A day doesn't go by that I don't wish I knew back then what I now know. So if there's someone out there who is worried about their brain health, if something just doesn't feel right, if you're worried about a loved one, there is help. Please get help. Please reach out. We can no longer sweep this disease under the rug. This is a preventable brain disease, as I just said, as we all know, and it's taking way too many lives. We need to act now. We need to ensure the next generation of young athletes are playing their chosen sport in the safest possible environment. We have a massive responsibility to them and their futures.
Amanda, thanks for sharing your experience and also Paul's story with us today on This Medical Life.
It's not a problem. Thank you for your time, and I hope together we can all make a difference and make sport safer for our next generation of budding out athletes, because we don't want to take it away from them. We just want to make sure it's as safe as possible.
We continue now our deep dive into CTE by welcoming back Associate Professor Michael Buckland. He's Senior Staff Specialist and the Head of the Department of Neuropathology at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, founder and Director of the Australian Sports Brain Bank as well. Michael, welcome back to This Medical Life.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Now, for this particular interview, we'd like to start with your first case of CTE that you diagnosed. Can you walk us through that?
It took me a long time to finally get that first brain to look at. But that very first one, I can actually talk about it because I know the family are very happy and have talked about it before. But that was the late, great Steve Folkes, Canterbury Bulldogs legend and premiership winning coach who tragically passed away, I think it was in 2018. I was able to examine his brain, and that was really the first time I'd examined a brain from someone like that. I still remember putting that first slide under the microscope with the tau stain on it, and just it was like I was looking at a picture from one of the medical, one of the medical journals that the Boston group had published describing the pathology. It was like, there it is. It's there. It's there. I then realised, actually, in retrospect, because generally the way we'd been sampling the brain to look at under the microscope was such that because we weren't thinking about CTE, we weren't sampling it in the right way. So the way I had been taught as a pathology trainee, I'd spent a lot of time in forensics, the way I'd been taught to sample and examine a brain, which obviously was a very good way, but it was a way in which you were unlikely to detect the disease. Part of my job now as well is to try and educate all the forensic pathologists and all autopsy pathologists that you gotta sample the brain this way if you want to be able to really properly screen it for CTE.
What was your response from the community and sporting organisations once you'd said, we actually have a case of CTE in Australia?
It was not overwhelmingly positive, I have to say that. It generated a lot of debate. I don't recall being contacted directly by any sporting organisation after we published our first case. Certainly earlier on, to be honest, I think actually now that the sporting codes are better than they were back then. So we only talked about our first case after we had published in a very high quality peer-reviewed scientific journal. And similarly, the first case in Australian rules football, we only talked about it after our results had been published in a peer-reviewed, again, high quality scientific journal, a neuropathology journal. I do remember quite significant pushback from sporting doctors. I've never seen a sports medicine sort of training curriculum, but I'm not entirely sure how much time they spend on the diagnosis and classification of degenerative brain diseases. I suspect it's not a lot. So nevertheless, some of them feel very, very strongly that that falls within their remit or their area of expertise. I think that's something that should be addressed. But certainly, I remember some of the sports doctors getting on the radio saying that we'd never published anything in peer-reviewed journals, and No one had ever reviewed it. And I was concerned as these doctors were advising the sporting bodies, yet they seemed unaware of peer-reviewed publications. So it was certainly early on, it was not a pleasant experience. It has improved a lot since then, I have to say, and to the credit of some fantastic sports medicine doctors that understand and recognise the problem. So, yeah, a bumpy journey early on, but that's hopefully, I think we're on the right track now.
Is there any studies comparing the effects before and after a season of contact sport in athletes?
I'm aware of some from the US. We know college athletes played American football. There have been studies of their like a pre-season scan versus a post-season brain scan, and without any reported concussions, but just playing a season of contact sports, they're able to demonstrate statistically significant differences in white matter diffusivity on MRI, indicating there is actually subclinical white matter injury. Similarly, they perform these similar cohort of players perform worse on cognitive testing at the end of the season compared to the beginning of the season, again, without any reported concussions. Similarly, there's been a study showing elevated circulating markers of brain injury at the end of the season compared to pre-season, things like neurofilament light chain circulating in the blood. There is good evidence that there is subtle traumatic brain injury occurring in contact sports players with no reported concussions. And it worries me that someone that loves their footy may well do this year in, year out, may well, someone was telling me the other day that at their local footy club, often they're short of players in the higher grades and they'll pull. So not only is someone maybe playing one game of footy on the weekend, they turn around 2 hours later and play in the senior grade to fill in for someone else. So it does worry me, that sort of exposure. And I think we need to start thinking of it as an issue of exposure, just like radiation, just like the summer sun. You've got to measure your exposure and you've got to manage it properly.
The hard thing here is, and this is what I'm trying to grappling with getting this episode together, is what is almost the recommendation, like what from with all of our experts saying, okay, we understand this disease, what is the recommendations that we're going to sort of approach children's or community sport and say, here's how best knowledge on how to prevent that? What would be probably some of the recommendations you would say?
I think there are two fundamental principles. One of them is reducing a person's cumulative lifetime exposure to these repeated head impacts. And the other one is delaying the age first exposure. So may be aware the recent position statement from the Royal College of Pathologists recommended modified low or no contact versions of contact sports before the age of 14. And I strongly endorse that. I think that's particularly relevant for schools. There's a lot of schools where participation in contact sports is actually compulsory. And these schools, their responsibility is the education and health of our children. And I think all schools should actually need to have a long, hard think about whether or not they're actually fulfilling their obligations to our children by making them play contact sports.
Let's kick that ball a little further then, because as this is a public health issue, what sort of leadership do you hope will come from the government on this issue?
From what I can tell, I'm unaware of any long-term success of industry self-regulation. Banks, insurance industries, James Hardie, asbestos. We're now seeing things with silicosis and stonemasons. So far, I don't think any public health measure has been successful if we leave it for industry self-regulation. So we do need government leadership. But I think I was just talking about this the other day. What we need is some health economists to get into this and to try and work out the cost to the Australian public. Many people wouldn't be aware that the large sporting organisations such as the AFL and the NRL, they enjoy tax-free status, just like the Catholic Church. So we are paying for them to organise their activities, and we're paying at the other end, but we don't yet know how much to deal with the fallout from exposure to unregulated exposure to these contact sports. So I think there's actually the community, I think, is paying a lot of money. I think that's something will convince government and voters that, in fact, this needs to change.
Well, on that note, we normally finish off by asking for any advice for GPs in particular. I want to broaden it for this one. Any final thoughts for GPs, but also parents, on this aspect of CTE?
A few thoughts. So one for GPs is certainly be aware of it, and I would educate yourself as much as you can, and potentially, where appropriate, pass on that information to parents that bring their child into your surgery, and make sure that they're aware of the risks. I think for parents, I would urge every parent not to let their child play contact sports until they're 14. And I mean, I know that can be really hard because, I mean, I was very lucky. I'm a parent. I was very lucky. Neither of my boys showed any interest in contact sports. So I never had to deal with what I know a lot of parents deal with, which is that their child is desperate to play and all their friends are playing. And so that's a much harder decision then, because there are negative consequences to stopping them playing or not allowing them to play, which is why we need that overarching regulation. We need the codes and the government to come along with us. So Johnny can play with his mates, but we know he's playing a safer version of the game. Personally, for all parents, if it's at all possible, don't let them play. And because if you wait for the codes to come to the party and fix things up, it'll be too late for all of your children, to anyone listening now. It'll be too late for them. They'll be having unregulated exposure. So that's my opinion.
Doctors and parents will both get some pushback of bravado. Mate, I've done it for years. You've probably experienced this too. So very final thing, have you worked any strategies out in how to deal with that approach, which I'm sure our GP listeners are bound to be subjected to?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't have particularly good strategies at this stage. What I often say is that as a kid, if I wanted to catch the bus, I had to get onto a smoke-filled bus, and it was awful, but you had no choice. Can't imagine any child this day. I think they'd all be horrified if you made them get into a bus full of cigarette smoke and breathe that smoke for an hour. In fact, you'd probably be charged with child abuse or seatbelts. There's been numerous public health measures that have got lots of pushback at the time, but in a generation or so, we look back and think, how the hell could they have let us? How could our parents have thought that was okay to let us do that? So often these things do take generational change to really embed themselves. I mean, probably the most recent one, certainly for me, was exposure to the midday sun. Probably you guys are probably like me. I don't know how old you are, so I don't mean to insult you. But when I was growing up, there was no sun sense at all. You just went out and played, and that was fine. It didn't matter if your skin peeled off the next week at school. That was just part of summer fun. But I mean, now that's almost akin to child abuse, letting your kid get burnt to a crisp. So we've got to think about like that, and think about what our kids will be thinking when they're 55. Why did my mum and dad let me do that? How could they let me do that?
Let's hope we all get the wisdom to be on the right side of history on that one. Associate Professor Michael Buckland, thank you again for joining This Medical Life.
Thanks very much for having me on again.
Dr. Stephanie Adams is an honorary fellow in sport and brain health at the University of Edinburgh. She's the founder and director of ConcusED and strives to make accurate concussion information more accessible and memorable for all stakeholders. Stephanie's helped lead the evaluation of the Global Massive Open Online Course, or MOOC as they're called, on concussion, a partnership between the University of Calgary and University Laval. More recently, she led the development and rollout of the Sport and Exercise for Brain Health MOOC on the Future Learn platform. She's a member of the Scottish Concussion Advisory Group, which is responsible for the Scottish Sports Concussion Guidance. Stephanie is a retired rugby and equestrian athlete and brings experience from several teaching and leadership roles in universities, school and sports settings, and was recently appointed Head of Sports Science for the Scottish Brain Sciences. Dr. Adams is our guest today on This Medical Life podcast. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really good to be here.
You've piqued my curiosity before we start proper. You played rugby and you're an equestrian. We all think concussion when we think rugby, but I guess if you fall off a horse, there are big consequences. Is it 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, or is that perpetual banging on rugby a little more higher risk than, from a concussion perspective, what happens on horses?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. And I don't think there is a definitive answer. Every concussion is unique. Every person is unique, and there's so much involved there with the forces. We do know that, one concussion could have one symptom, and that could be, severe for that particular individual. So there's just so many factors involved. When we look at rugby in particular, we know that, increasingly, we know that rugby is among the top sports with highest risks, at adult and youth level. Equally, equestrian sports also has high risk, but they are different sports with different mechanisms and different variables. So there's a lot to look in there and consider.
Yes, and of course you wear helmets when you do equestrian work.
Yes, and I think importantly to note, certainly when we look at guidance that's provided to parents, to teachers, to even within the medical personnel, and things that you'd advise in a conversation with someone, the science shows that concussions the helmets don't fully prevent concussions. They do a brilliant job, provided that the helmet is safe and well looked after in terms of reducing risk of skull fractures. But in terms of concussion, it just doesn't fully prevent them there. So they are really important. Always wear them. I'm happy to admit I've never gotten on a horse without a helmet. Absolutely wear them in the sports where they're advised, but they don't fully prevent concussion.
And one last question without notice. My apologies, but I've been watching the Test cricket, the Test cricket here in Australia, and I've noticed that the new protocol is if a cricket ball hits a helmet, no matter whether it was a slight glance or a direct hit, the physio comes out to do a check. I'm expecting you to be quite heartened by that protocol.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'll be the first to admit I'm not up to speed on what's happening on cricket, but the fact that they are coming up to do the check, sort of going towards perhaps that sort of if in doubt, sit them out, let's pause, let's assess things. That's a really good step in the right direction if they're starting to add protocols that could potentially check for concussion.
Yeah, exactly. And it's great listening to the commentators trying not to be standoffish about it and actually follow suit.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. But what I really wanted to start with is I'm a sucker for a good visual pun, and the program Concussed, or ConcusED, but on paper it's Concussed. I love that. Being run in Scotland. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So ConcusED was really born off the back of my PhD work, which was looking at essentially specializing in concussion education, but looking at how we can improve its effectiveness. So at its core, looking at how we can improve the actual education part. So we champion the use of teaching information that's evidence-based on concussion, but also looking at how we teach, when that information is delivered, who it's delivered to, what are the characteristics of those individuals coming into the room. So how can we design that concussion education in a way that hopefully facilitates that person taking that information and using it in a positive way. Because let's face it, we all come into this topic potentially with different baseline understandings, potentially different attitudes, be that positive or negative. And just looking at maybe those tiny tweaks we could do from an educational design point of view that would help people take action and really listen is what we've looked at. And that comes through my research work during PhD around looking at literature in educational science and psychological sciences.
Is this in conjunction with the brain health promotion of now it's the Scottish Brain Sciences? Is that in conjunction or is that something separate?
Completely separate. So I do wear a few different hats.
Can you tell us about the brain health promotion with the Scottish Brain Sciences?
Sure. So Scottish Brain Sciences is a recently established life sciences company led by my mentor and colleague, Professor Craig Ritchie, who's a renowned researcher in Alzheimer's disease. So Scottish Brain Sciences, essentially, life sciences, we run clinical trials, anything to do with sports, be that potential research, be that potential innovation or education work as well, because we do have an educational sort of component to what we do. Anything focused on sport in brain health, that's part of what I feed into. So brain health includes concussion, of course, but we also look at the additional factors that we know can affect our brain health across the life course. So, physical inactivity being one of them, blood pressure and unmanaged blood pressure, things like that, looking at all the different factors we currently know about that might affect later life brain health.
So looking at the program of Concussed Ed, who is that intended for?
Great question. Thank you. So we work with a number of different groups and stakeholders across Scotland, and also interface on a few groups that are more national at UK level and international as well. So as an example, we support Sport Scotland, the national governing body of sport, on their work within concussion education. And that's the group that is part of really leading that If in Doubt, Sit Them Out campaign. We also specialize in programs for university athletes and across Scotland, as well as coaches and PE teachers. So recently, with support from a group here called Scottish Student Sport, we actually launched an online module for university athletes and coaches specifically, and any university or college that's part of that Scottish Student Sport network, they can tap into that. So it's really this targeted module relevant to Scotland, but particularly university athletes and the resources that they have access to or the things they need to think about if they get a concussion in university. That's what that course focuses on.
So one of the things we've been discussing with CTE, in particular of these episodes, and the link of concussion is not as strong as the link of head injury. And it's one of those things, do you discuss about potentially head injury without concussion, or is it mainly just concussion?
No, we mainly focus on concussion, but we focus on actually, it's funny, the terminology is really critical. So certainly what we speak to, which aligns to the UK guidance, is seeing concussion as a brain injury. So because I'm not necessarily educating the doctors or the medical personnel that will be going through different protocols. And I know the use of head injury and the different scales come in slightly differently. But because I'm typically educating those that may not have a medical background, we focus on concussion is a brain injury. Brain injury can be fatal. Or head injury can be fatal. So focusing on that.
Now, there is a motto that I liked. It says, if in doubt, sit them out. Where did that come from?
Yeah, so If in Doubt, Sit Them Out has been around for a while, a few years even before I moved to Scotland, actually. Where it started it was launched here in Scotland originally after the incredibly tragic death of Benjamin Robinson, who was a schoolboy rugby player, and that was in 2011. The program has been championed by Ben's father, Peter, as well as mother Karen, along with a number of just really fantastically incredible colleagues. For example, Dr. James Robson, Professor Willie Stewart, amongst many others. But that's sort of where that started. And the whole program is about recognizing that concussion can be fatal. It's about erring on the side of caution and recognizing that we only get one brain. And the campaign itself takes, I think, several critical messages, including that it only takes one person to recognize potential signs of concussion, and really recognizing that it doesn't have to be the doctor. It doesn't have to be the referee or coach. In fact, it might not. It might be a concerned parent from the sidelines who recognizes there's potential risk, a potential concussion has happened, and they stand up. And I think we've come a long way in terms of culture and confidence around that. There's always work to do. I think, 10, 20 years ago, the thought of a parent or someone on the sidelines speaking up against a coach or referee, I think that experience would have been maybe even more challenging than today. And there's still a long way to go, and education is part of that. But it's really this campaign about empowering us to look after one another and recognizing that we all have a role to play. It's up to the doctors to make the diagnosis, but we all have a role to play in terms of facilitating that if in doubt, sit them out, erring on the side of caution approach to when there's a potential concussion.
We're finding that school children and teammates are actually recognizing when one of their mates is a little bit off, and they're actually saying he's not quite right. And even the professionals are doing this, that something's not, someone's a bit disorientated or something to that effect. But can I ask, what symptoms do you actually tell the children to be looking out for with concussion?
Yeah. So concussion's, I think, an interesting one. The doctors notoriously say it's, among the hardest injuries to diagnose a concussion. I think part of that is because there's still this, the list of symptoms is quite long. But I think, if there's an index of suspicion and a potential incident, some of the signs and symptoms someone might look for are things like headaches, confusion, loss of memory. Immediately, you might see someone stumbling or struggling to get up, things like this. But some common ones that do start to evolve are things like headache, confusion, loss of memory. As I said, it's not uncommon to see things like dizziness, being bothered by light or noise, having trouble concentrating or feeling irritable or anxious as well. And some people also have trouble with their sleep, whether that's trouble falling asleep or trouble staying awake. So there's a variety of signs and symptoms, physical, cognitive or mental, and emotional. And it's having this sort of broad awareness of these and putting two and two together when we see a potential incident of concussion.
Stephanie, I'm curious to know how you counter the competitive spirit, because I had a great chat about cricket. I won't go into details, but where there's a potential caught behind and no one knows if it's true, but a batsman will often walk because they know they are out, and that's the right thing to do, and the rest of the team get really grumpy. If someone's seeing someone showing a slightly dodgy sign, but you're 1 point down, there's a minute and a half to go, that competitive spirit that attracts these people to the field at all ages is there. How do you counter that and put it into perspective for the greater good that's going to have lifelong potential consequences?
Oh, gosh. I mean, that is both an interesting and a challenging question. I think my gut is, as I've said before, we only get one brain. You need to look after it. As I said, I've been an athlete. I was a blindside flanker, quite an intense position. And I love it. I've been in that feeling. But the more I understand about the brain, the more I understand about the potential effects of concussion if we don't manage it, that trumps all for me, honestly. I know that might sound so silly, but it honestly, you have to look after it. And I think that's a key moment where I would be really hopeful that the refs, those overseeing the game, can intervene and just make a decision, because it's someone's life on the line.
Yeah.
What sports are you typically focusing on for these programs?
Oh, so all sports, honestly. So Concussa, the partnerships we have with a few different university sports unions, we really initially started focusing on high contact sports like rugby, football, or soccer. But actually, the more we looked into it and the more we looked at the data from the programs and through the conversations with the athletes, we're actually finding that there is huge value in educating the collective. I've known of badminton athletes having concussion. I've also known of student athletes from non-contact sports who've sustained their concussion from walking to their lecture. So the more people who are educated, regardless of that's rugby, as I said, equestrian, or any sport, the more empowered we are as a group to be looking after one another. And I think that's increasingly something we move towards. So this evening, actually, I'm headed over to Glasgow to work with a group of 40 or so athletes. I know that there's rugby athletes, there's equestrian athletes, there's basketball athletes, there's a couple of badminton attending. So it's not just the contact sports that we're focused on. It's really educating collective.
Is there an average time you recommend for someone who has a concussion? Let's say it's grassroots football. Is there a recommended time for them to stay off sport before they return?
Great question. So I think might depend. The answer to that might vary slightly depending on which national guidance are being looked at. So here in the UK, there's been a recent amendment to the guidance. And the current advice is that there should be no return to sports competition until at least 21 days since the day of the injury. Okay, so it's giving that few weeks. So at grassroots level, no return to sports competition before 3 weeks. However, that said, there's a few other principles of that sort of influence what happens. So there's something called the relative rest period. So for the first 24 to 48 hours, this is about resting physically, resting mentally. So absolutely no return to sport on the day, no return to competition. It's about resting. One tweak that I think surprises many, but is maybe quite intuitive in some ways, but it's also really challenging, is limiting screen time. So we know that limiting screen time, particularly during the first 48 hours, is really, really supportive for concussion recovery. I think, telling that to a 12, 13-year-old, huge challenge. But if we can limit their screen time for the first 48 hours, the guidance and the evidence is suggesting that that's really helpful to setting them up for recovery. Once that relative rest period is complete, then the idea is about getting people back to physical activity, but in a staged, progressive manner, and working through this progressive staged return to play, and then the sort of full sports competition at the end, provided there's been no symptoms at rest, and a few other nuances as well. What I would say to your listeners is, if they're interested in seeing an example of this, there's a UK concussion guidance, and there's an example of what I'm speaking about in this table within that document, and that's certainly freely available online.
Now, this touches on, I'm not sure what it would be like in Scotland, but certainly here, sport is pretty much a religion. You have competition, we're all playing for sheep stations. It's all, out there on the field. But turning around and saying, okay, concussion, dust it off, there's a level of toughness, come on, she'll be right, versus 3 weeks off if someone's got a bit of a head knock. And this is the sort of the perception that you have. What has been the response that you've actually had from sporting communities to these guidelines?
It's a really good question. And obviously I can only speak to the examples and sort of experiences that I've lived through. But I think generally, because certainly in Scotland, there's this unified approach that, we're really striving really hard to push, and that's been championed by Scotland to the point where it's now adopted elsewhere. I'd say it's been well received. I think as Peter Robinson and many others have said before, it's about singing from the same hymn sheet. This can, really help to facilitate communication and slow culture change. Culture change takes years, and we have so much more we can obviously do within concussion. But I think generally speaking, if we can keep that firm line and just continuing to reiterate that message and provide education why that 21 days, for example, things like how much it can affect performance. Performance is something athletes really, really focus on, knowing that they are just not at their best. And they are, if it's a team sport, potentially putting their team's performance at risk if they're in there. Little tiny tweaks, that's just one example of being part of the education. Just slowly over time, we can build momentum to really understand and respect that 21 days. Also, I think if I could just add as well, I think it's really important to continue that consistency, because nowadays so many youth, just an example, play multiple sports. So if we can continue to have that same grassroots message, and if someone sustains a concussion in rugby, they're following the same approach as if, say, basketball. How much of a mixed message would that be for a young mind if suddenly they're allowed to get back within one sport but not the other? So working really hard to keep that consistency, I think, is really key. And I would also like to add as well, 21 days till sports competition, that doesn't mean they can't start getting active. In fact, we know once that relative rest period is done, it's good to get moving, but slowly and in a staged way that is below what's called our subsymptom threshold. So if symptoms are coming on when I'm doing a little bit of stationary cycling, that's a hint that maybe I need to pause and come back and try later. But sort of this progression. So athletes are now getting back to, maybe attending training and supporting their team in other ways, but they're not out doing the drills in the same way they would be. So we're looking after one another. We're slowly moving and getting back. So participating in different ways, if that makes sense.
There is a bit of a difference, though. I'm not quite sure, again, what it's like in Scotland, but the rule of thumb coming out from the elite sport tends to be they take 10 days off for concussion, seems to be, or around a week, a bit over a week. Is that something that is there a reason for the difference, or is this potentially just the sport doing what they think is best, probably balancing their commitments as well?
Hopefully it's always the science leading the decisions. There are differences, absolutely. I think the key component here is that an elite athlete may have access in this instance to a multidisciplinary healthcare team, and something that's often sort of thought or known as sort of enhanced care pathway. So they have access to some resources that might not happen at grassroots. They have access to looking at sort of multimodal care plans around them and considering their medical history, their psychological situation, cognitive situation and performance, musculoskeletal, vestibular recovery. So there's this sort of enhanced care pathway that's built around that athlete, and at the whoever's in charge in that medical role, at their discretion, they've made that plan, and they feel that individual has, for their concussion, they're ready to progress in a slightly different manner.
I really wish back in the early 2000s, when the BBC had a TV show called Footballers' Wives based in the UK, I would have loved this protocol to have been one of the storylines one week when an elite soccer player had to go without and work out how. It would have been so good to have that immersed into the pop culture.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Stephanie, just finally, have you got any final thoughts or advice for doctors, for GPs, about concussion in children in particular?
Great question. I think probably more of a wish, if that's all right.
Yeah.
And I think that would be, I'd really encourage doctors to look up the If in Doubt, Sit Them Out campaign. to familiarize themselves with the latest guidance. I know GPs have so much to stay up to date on, and hopefully, this is one of those investments that will really support their patients long term. We know, the more doctors who can inform themselves of the latest practice around this graduated return to activity and sport program, I think the better. Recognizing that it's no longer advised to just sit in a dark room until symptoms are fully gone, and before you do any movement or sport, recognizing that. And not just saying, oh, you'll be fine, go home and rest and head back to school tomorrow. That's not where we're at anymore, and that's not helpful. It's not what patients are looking for, certainly with players. So I wish, if I could leave the last point as a wish to doctors to look up the latest guidance in their country, and just remember, if in doubt, sit them out. You only get one brain. We know concussion or brain injury is a modifiable risk factor for dementia in later life. And the more we can encourage a safe, responsible management when and if the injury happens, the better.
Dr. Stephanie Adams, thank you so much for joining This Medical Life.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
The Royal College of Pathologists for Australasia have issued a position statement on CTE and calls on the government for action. The causal link between repeated traumatic brain injuries and the development of CTE requires urgent attention. Research conducted by the RCPA revealed that 98% of Australians watched contact or combat sports, with 94% rating their level of concern of head impacts between moderate up to extreme. 92% of parents and carers for children said they were concerned about the implications of potential head impacts sustained while playing contact or combat sports, with 84% reporting they would like to see changes made to minimise the risk of head impacts when playing. There are a number of recommendations the RCPA makes in this position statement. If you're involved in community sport, contact or combat sports at any level, government policy and or public health, we encourage you to have a read. The links are in the show notes to this episode. This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts on social media. Dr. Travis Brown can be found on X. His username is @Dr. Travis Brown. That's Dr. Travis Brown. And Steve Davis can be found on LinkedIn. Go to linkedin.com/in/TheRealSteveDavis. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.